Hi there, I'm Corey. I'm with the 4-H Ag Innovators Experience through a grant program through BEAR. This year's grants and innovative experience is Water Connects Us All. It's an idea that we need to be taking better care of our ecosystem, specifically our water and our agricultural and economic and urban practices when it comes to treating our water. So one of the main things that we look at is when it comes to water and its conservation is, of course, the water cycle. Here's a diagram of the water cycle. Learned about it in 3rd grade science, where water from everywhere, from ponds to puddles, from oceans to rivers, one day evaporate, they go up into the clouds, and they go up into the sky, they form clouds, and they come back down form of rain, and they make those ponds, they make those puddles, and they make those rivers and oceans. So this is a big, huge, important step when it comes to the conservation, because with some of our engineering practices that you're going to learn about shortly, this is a big part. We also need to understand how we use our water. Now, every morning I wake up and I take a shower because I'm hygienic like that, and I'm sure plenty of you do as well. So we use water in a lot of different ways, from personal use like taking a shower, brushing your teeth, to consumption of just drinking it to stay hydrated, or we can use it for agricultural practices, watering our land, watering our livestock, and we can use it for industrial purposes, for certain plants and other things like that. And when it comes to using this water, we need to make sure we're using it respectfully and responsibly, or else we might not have it in the future, and we want to make sure that we're protecting it as much as possible. So we're going to dive a little bit into the specifics of the agricultural practices. We are 4-H, and that's something we like to focus on. But there are some other engineering practices that don't necessarily focus on that. So when it comes to it, what we're breaking this down into is the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, and how we need to better ourselves, better our practices, so that we can protect the water that we all use and love. So here's a diagram of the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is an element that normally is found in the air or in plants or in specific animals. It makes up most of our air, and it normally stays there as N2. It doesn't combine with anything else, and we can't just consume it by that way. So the way we consume it is through plants. Now, the way plants get it is either through specific types of bacteria, or the plant itself will take it. And then from there, animals can eat those kinds of plants or that kind of bacteria, and that's how the nitrogen cycle works. They eat it, they get rid of it somehow, and then we end up with it somehow. And then after that, it goes back into the air after it decays. So nitrogen is a very important tool. It helps us fertilize our crops, and it helps us with a lot of other things. So when we use it, it also likes to combine with other things and likes to pollute other things, and that's because it's an element, that's what they do. So here's a chart of nitrogen and where we use it the most. So if you look here, you might notice that the state of Kansas is right there, and it's a little bit closer to this red and yellow spot right there. That's where we use the most of our nitrogen. That's where the most of our nitrogen pollution comes from. We need to be making sure that we use the correct practices when it comes to using this nitrogen, or else it can lead to pollution. So down in the Gulf of Mexico, if you will, down here by Texas and Louisiana, there's this dead zone that's been created by too much nitrogen pollution. And what the problem with this is when someone says dead zone, it's kind of ambiguous. So what it means is that for a certain amount of ocean, nothing can live there. So there's this red zone where nothing can live, no plants, no sea life. So if you like shrimp, that's dead. It can't live that close. Fishermen have to go farther away. and it just slowly graduates in and out. Every year it's a little bit better, it's a little bit worse, it's a little bit better, it's a lot of bit worse. And we're just increasing this dead zone because farmers and consumers continue to pollute with nitrogen and with other chemicals that we use in fertilizers. So we need to make sure that we're using the correct practices. Throughout this video and throughout this experience, we're going to be showing you some engineering practices that can hopefully teach you ways in which we can curb our nitrogen pollution and make our world better. The first of which is we're going to be going over the wetlands model.
Hi, my name is Gina Meseroff.
And I'm Ellen Meseroff, and we are members of the Lakely Horseshoe 4-H Club in the Wilson County, Kansas District.
We are glad to be a part of the Water Connects Us All grant. Today we will be showing you a wetland model. So what the supplies you will need if you want to do this at home is a cookie sheet to catch any spills, 2 plastic tubs, modeling clay, blue and red dye, water that you put the red dye into, which represents the nutrients, a thing of dirt, packing tape, Mr. Clean Magic Eraser, blue dye in the water, which represents the clean ocean water or rainwater. And then you have to have a catch basin to put all of the supplies that are yucky when you're done in. And then paper towels.
Step 1, you need to get a chunk of clay out of the package, and then you need to mold it so it makes a sloping downward hill right here. Water travels from high to low areas. The water will travel down the hill to the bottom of the container.
Next, add soil to the hill to represent soil from a tilted farm field. You just want to sprinkle it slightly onto the hill and spread it out some. If there's any rock chunks, you want to remove that. When the rain falls, the soil will be washed down into the river and turn it brown.
Next step, blue water represents the river, which is clean water. All you have to do is just pour it in so it barely covers the bottom of the pan. And then you take the red water. The red water represents fertilizer runoff. Look and see. The blue water is no longer blue. What happened to the water in the basin? The water is no longer blue. It is polluted with chemicals from the fertilizer. The second half of the experiment begins like the first. You put the clay and the soil into the container. The clay represents the hill and the soil represents the tilled farmland. The next step is to take the sponge. The sponge represents a wetland. You put the sponge right up against the base of the hill, and then you take your packing tape and tape the sponge to the container. So the sponge stays in place.
Be sure to put the clay in the indentions of the container because the container is not level. You need to make sure that the sponge fits on tightly. That way it doesn't seep through the gaps. The next step is to take the blue liquid and pour it in to represent the river, which is clean water. Then it's gonna rain, and the red water represents the chemicals and fertilizer. As you can see, the sponge is starting to absorb it on the sides, stopping the nutrients from getting in and mixing with the clean water over here. Wetlands typically are located in low areas and are like basins to collect water. The plastic tub represents a basin. The sponge represents the wetlands that hold water and absorb nutrients. So wetlands are like a sponge. Thank you for listening.
Hi guys, my name is Shelby Smith. Welcome to the Water Connects Us All Challenge, and I will be demonstrating the saturated buffer engineering practice. So first of all, you're going to have your purple water, and this represents blue water that is a stream or runoff from a field, and then that's combined with red, which represents nitrogen and nitrates that are in fertilizers that travel with the water, and together that's what makes the water look purple. So the first thing you're going to do is mark the water line on your cup right where the water ends, and then you're going to take half of it and pour it into a second cup, and then mark the water line on your first cup again. So you're going to take, you've got 2 lines on your cup now, and then you're going to take the water that's left in this cup and you're going to slowly pour it through your soil and your saturated buffer. You can't pour it too fast or it'll overflow. So as I'm doing this, guys, be thinking about how you think this is happening and what you think is happening as the water comes through. And then, I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look down here, the water is losing a lot of its color. And this represents that the soil is holding on to the nitrates that are in the water, and the soil's holding on to it, and that represents that the soil acts as a sponge. So we're gonna give that a minute to soak through. And while that's soaking through there, the soil and the coffee filter actually represents the saturated buffer. And the saturated buffer is an area next to a field where water drains out and it's collected. So pouring the liquid over the soil represents the water from the field traveling into the tile and draining into the tiles of the saturated buffer. So as it drips through there, that represents the saturated buffer, which is a patch of dirt at the edge of your field that soaks up water. So once your water is soaking through, you're going to mark the water line on your cup again, right where it stops, right there. And then you're going to take the rest of your purple water and you're going to pour it into your cup with your soil in it. Make sure you don't overflow it, because that's very possible and it's very messy. So what do you guys notice as the water is passing through when the saturated buffer is already wet? It's coming through a lot slower, right? So the first time it went through, it drained through pretty fast for a little bit, and then once the soil got wet, it started going a lot slower. So this is because it's already wet, and once it's wet, it's going to hold it better, and it's not going to let it go through it as well. Like I said, the purple represents the combination of the rainwater that's from the field, which is the blue, and then nitrates and fertilizer, which is red, and put together that makes it purple. And then once again, the color change, you'll notice how it's a lot clearer and a lot more brown. It's purple, and that's because the soil is a sponge and it soaks up a lot of those nitrates and the nutrients from the fertilizer. So once it's kind of done soaking through, you're just going to unclasp your binder clips and carefully throw everything away. Well, when you do that, why would you expect less water to come out after the buffer is saturated? Soil acts like a sponge and it retains water, and this is where the native plants and the saturated buffer come in. It increases the retention of the nutrients by using some of the nitrogen to help them grow. So we use nitrogen to help our plants grow and our crops grow, and it also helps native plants grow, and so it's good to have some native plants planted in your saturated buffer. And then how does the saturated buffer remove nitrogen from the water? A saturated buffer is like a sponge where water is redistributed in the soil near the edge of the field. So this helps convert the nitrates to free nitrogen while at the same time it holds water and before it's discharged to the stream. So it basically soaks up all the water and it uses the nitrogen and the nitrates to help the plants grow, and the rest of the water that it doesn't need will go into a stream or a river. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Johanna Walker, and I am representing the 4-H Ag Innovators Experience. I'm going to be teaching you about bioswales. We're going to start off with what a bioswale is. Bioswales are water runoff conveyance systems. They are basically the alternate to a storm sewer. They absorb water runoff, and bioswales improve water quality by filtering rainwater. We have a little demonstration here. The red here represents fertilizer. The green represents pet waste. And the blue represents motor oil. And then we have a cup of salt, which represents salt that is applied to your driveways whenever it snows or ices. I am going to pour water into each of these cups, and each of these cups are contaminants. And the water is going to represent rain. So I'm going to pour some water into the red first. Then the green. Then the blue. And last, the cup of salt. So we have our contaminants, and we've poured water into all of them. And then I'm going to pour all of the contaminants into the container, which is our sewer system. So we're going to start with our fertilizer. And then we're going to go on to our pet waste. And then our motor oil. And then last, our salt. And you can kind of see the color. And now it's more of brown color. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add sponges here. And so we're going to lay our blue sponges along the side of the container or the sewer. So we're going to lay it about like this. Okay, and once we've laid out our blue sponges on these sides, we're going to take our yellow sponges and our blue sponges, they represent soil. So there's that. And so our yellow sponges, we're going to stand our yellow sponges upright. So I don't know if you can see this. Probably not. So the water's been absorbed almost completely. And after the water has been absorbed, this is what these sponges should look like. And you can see in the sponges how much of those contaminants have been absorbed. And so you can actually see how well a bioswale will really do. So that's just a little demo of a bioswale. So the cost of a bioswale will vary between $3,000 to $7,000. It really just depends on the size, the type of plant that you use for your native plants, and it also depends on where it is located. Bioswales are less expensive when they are near underground piping, and they're usually located near cities. They are sized to convey at least a 10-year storm. Some other contaminants are any kinds of fossil fuels. To prevent some of these contaminants, you can check to see if you even need fertilizer for your crops or fields, or you can check how much you will need. And also, you can drive your vehicles less when it's not needed.
Hi, I'm Anthony, and I'm with the Water Connects Us All Challenge. Today, I'm going to teach you how to make and show you how a bioreactor works. So what you're going to want to do is have a plastic container, which will represent our river, straw, which will represent the tiling in our field, the cup, which is going to represent our field with the fertilizer applied to it, and a bottle with some wood chips in it that'll represent our bioreactor later on. So what you're going to want to do is take hydrogen peroxide, spray it a couple times into this cup, and then take phenolphthalein and put a couple drops of that into your cup. Then add water, and you'll see that the water changes colors with the fertilizer, which is the phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide, and it turns the water red. And that represents nitrogen from the fertilizer going into our river. Now, once it's done draining, you can add our bioreactor, which has wood chips mixed with Glacier Cherry Gatorade in it, and we'll see how that changes with the water. A bioreactor, which isn't really used in Kansas much, but up north, it's used to filter out nitrogen from runoff water from when it rains and there's fertilizer in your fields. So what it does is rain comes down and mixes with the fertilizer, and that drains into the bioreactor, which is put into tiling, which is also more used up north than it is in Kansas, and then that bioreactor filters out the nitrogen and drains it into the river more safely because there's less nitrogen in the water then. So with the bioreactor being there now, the water is a lot less red than it was before, and it's doing its job filtering out the nitrogen in the water.
Hi, I'm Corey, and it's now my honor to teach you about the engineering practice known as the rain garden. When I went to Iowa, this was my favorite engineering practice to learn about. Mostly because I grew up in Kansas City in the suburb of Olathe, and it was an urban setting. I'm not really a classical, country kid. And I grew up in an urban setting. And a lot of these other engineering practices do deal with those farming and agricultural engineering practices. But this one's something that even a city slicker like me could do to help reduce our nitrogen pollution. So right here in front of us is the rain garden activity, and it's to demonstrate the engineering practice known as a rain garden. So right here is our rain garden, right in front of our standard urban house. Its job is going to be to collect rainwater and other pollutants before they head off wherever they go. So first, before we learn about the rain garden, we're going to learn about what exactly happens normally with infiltration and with how we treat our water. So without a rain garden, without any engineering practice, we're going to say that one day it rains, right? And so here we have these blue magnets, and we're going to place them all over our board. So it's raining one day. Right, so it's rained. So one thing that happens after it rains is if you don't have too saturated of ground, not too dense of ground, it infiltrates into the ground and becomes part of groundwater, which is very important, especially here in the state of Kansas. So the next step would be on any tile that you see green, you're going to have that flow into the groundwater that you see down here in this bin. So we're going to move it to groundwater. Now, water cannot infiltrate if it's on a man-made surface like concrete, unless if it was specifically designed to do so, or like a house where it runs off into a gutter. So now you're going to follow the arrows on the sheet to see where they go. So on concrete, well, it just flows down into the street. And on the roof, it flows off the roof down into the street. Well, if you have a gutter, it can flow out into the yard, and it can become grain water once you give it time to infiltrate. So all this water then ends up going to the river. So that's the natural process without any added fertilizers or anything like that. Now say if the night before a big rainstorm, you decided, you to yourself, you were going to put nitrogen fertilizer all over your grass to make sure it grew nice and healthy. Or it's been a harsh summer and it's not doing the greatest. So you want to make sure that it's all over your lawn. Well, it rains just that night, and it again covers all those same tiles that it did once before. So now there's a problem. As I mentioned before, rain would normally infiltrate down into groundwater unless the ground is oversaturated. Well, with those fertilizers now in the grass, in the ground, that's oversaturated. So the water can't infiltrate naturally. So any water that doesn't touch nitrogen, yeah, that flows into groundwater. But all this water that is touching nitrogen, well, now we have a problem. Now it's going to have to flow off the lawn into the sewer. So now we have all this nitrogen in the river. And as I talked through in the intro, a problem that we see is that these rivers, these things, they flow every which way and eventually end up in the Gulf of Mexico, because that's where our main drainage is here. And what happens is it creates that dead spot, like we were saying. So all that nitrogen is going to go eventually down a river, and it's going to start hurting ecosystems. And this is a negative effect. So what we want to do instead is we want to protect our water, and we want to protect our lawn, and we want to protect our ecosystems. So what we're going to do is we're going to install a rain garden. Now a rain garden is a hole, is I guess a starter way to say it. A hole that has been filled with certain materials, depending on who you consult and who you have install it, that help water infiltrate the ground faster. It's also filled with natural vegetation to your area, prairie grasses and prairie flowers and that kind of such here in the state of Kansas. So that way they can penetrate the ground as well. The reason these plants penetrate the ground better is because of their naturally long roots. So as they collect water, they're able to create holes that go deep down in the ground with their naturally long roots, and it's easier to permeate the ground better. So that's what a rain garden is basically made of. So this time let's look and see how the nitrogen responds this time with the rain garden in place. So again, the night before you decided you wanted to fertilize your ground, make sure your grass looked nice and pretty, that way your neighbors didn't have a better lawn than you. I know that's the worst thing living in suburbia. You don't want anybody to outshine your lawn. So rains that night, right? So it lands all over your house. And it rains in your yard. And so now we're going to look and see the effects of the rain garden, what this model is supposed to be showing us. So again, just like you did in the first time we did it through, we're going to follow the arrows. So these ones, yeah, they still flow out into the street because it's saturated. The water can't penetrate, but they flow out, right? So that failed to catch it. And these ones, they'll slip past the rain garden too in this activity. This water will flow out. This storm drain flow eventually to the river. But all these are going to get caught by our rain garden. So they're going to end up here in the rain garden. And now that it's there, the rain garden's job is to keep the water there. It's to collect the rain, to make sure it doesn't go any farther. That's why I kind of describe it as a hole, because it's a hole that holds water. So now that we have this here, it's going to penetrate the ground with the water. So now the water is going to become groundwater. And the nitrogen will stay in the rain garden and feed the plants that have been put there, which can process the nitrogen through the nitrogen cycle correctly. So the first time, all of our nitrogen wound up in the river, which is bad. It can damage ecosystems, and we don't want pollution. This next time, as you can see, that nitrogen, it caught some of it. So you could look at it and say, well, it doesn't catch all the nitrogen. Isn't that still bad? Well, yes, this is still bad, but this is an urban practice. It's the cheapest, actually, to make out of all the engineering practices that we have today. And it's just a small part to help with our nitrogen pollution. It's also a rudimentary model, so it's not going to work exactly like this, but the practice still is the same. The nitrogen's going to be stopped. So yeah, that's the rain garden.